Good morning. Oh, it's with so much excitement that I get to talk today to Ruthie Smith. I want to tell you about her. I was introduced to her by Manna, who interviewed me a few weeks back as in her topic, therapeutic astrology. And at the end of the conversation with Manna, she said, "Oh my gosh, Kim, you need to meet Ruthie Smith." So here we are, 2 weeks later, and I am very jazzed to have this dialogue today. Ruthie has quite a lot of accomplishments that I want to share. She is an author, a musician, and an energy psychotherapist. She has a long held interest in the shift of humanity's awakening in consciousness. Just take that in for a minute. She integrates energy and spirituality with psychotherapy. Oh my gosh. Quite amazing to have that integration. In her background, Ruthie is an attachment-based psychotherapist with a psychoanalytic orientation from the Bowlby Centre in London. All of you who know me, you know why I am so excited about this. Her interest in energy psychotherapy is 35 years long, and she has clinical experience in private practice, 10 years as a principal psychotherapist, and a supervisor in the National Health Service in the UK. She has taught extensively on psychotherapy trainings and is invited to speak all over the world at conferences and events. One of the most exciting accomplishments, I think, is her development of the Flame Centre all the way back in 2009. How am I doing so far?
I feel slightly shy.
And understandable, so that's why I get to gloat here. And she has a training program in supporting psychotherapists in their development of understanding and use of subtle energy. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. One of the highlights that I've been reading rapidly is this book, Energy, Soul Connecting, and Awakening Consciousness, Psychotherapy in a New Paradigm. And I love how this book outlines energy healing, quantum physics, the power of intention, integration in psychotherapeutic practice, and much more. So I think I'd like to start by asking Ruthie to tell us a little bit about her journey to the chosen path of joy, as this is the first chapter in the book and something I think is very important to her.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate your introduction. So I think joy, I first found joy through playing music. And I came from a background where my family, there was so much suffering in my family, as there are in the families of many people that become psychotherapists. I think we were kind of trained by our families, really. And you're nodding there with
Agree.
understanding. So, I mean, I share just the minimal about my family. I have the deepest love and respect for them. They've all passed on now, apart from one sister who has dementia. But anything I say about them, I say with respect and love, because I'm incredibly grateful to them for having given me life. So, I mean, basically, my mother had an undiagnosed mental illness. And so I think when you grow up as a child with that and nobody tells you, look, your mother's got a mental illness, your sense of reality is challenged, really, because you're trying to make sense of things that are crazy. And my sister was incredibly sensitive, and unfortunately, she developed paranoid schizophrenia. And she suffered so much. She was a beautiful soul. She was very, very gifted, sensitive, creative. But she was very persecuted, and eventually she took her own life. And it was, really difficult for the whole family, and most especially for my sister. But it must have been very hard for my mother. And so I kind of brought up, there were times when both my mother and my sister were both psychotic, and my father was uber rational. He was very, very bright and clever. He went to Cambridge University, and he was sort of really stuck in his head, frankly. And I was all into my feelings and sensitivity and emotions. So you can imagine we just went like that. We did not meet. And so I was the silly younger one who was too sensitive. And so I kind of grew up in a way being traumatically invalidated, we could say, because as I'm a Sagittarian, I tend to be a bit direct sometimes. And so I'd sort of blurt these things out in the family, sort of truths that I saw. And it was like, you're not supposed to say that. And so I kind of was quite traumatized. In the end, I just shut down and froze and stopped speaking, really. So my other sister was closer to my father, and she fared better, really. She went to Cambridge too. And as the youngest daughter, I was my mother's confidant, so I became a therapist, and I basically was sat and listened to her monologues. And so I didn't really learn to relate at all, because I was always just listening and never actually initiating any conversation. And so for many, many years, I'd be in situations where I was just listening and didn't know how to converse. But anyway, thank heavens for all sorts of things like therapy and energy therapy. I'm a different person now. And so I just took refuge in music. I played the cello, I sang, and I just escape home by going and playing in orchestras and singing, and that was wonderful. And it connected me with the vibrations of space and joy, and it was very, very soothing for my soul, really. Um, I was also really always interested in spirituality. And when I was 5, I sang this little song in the church bazaar about what do the stars do up in the sky, kind of so sweet. But I can remember the words now, but I really was wondering, what do the stars do up in the sky? So that's sort of the background of my family. And I suppose because there was so much pain, um, I was constantly trying to help my sister. And I just adored her. She was just such a sweet soul. But it was very hard. And in those days, which was years ago, they didn't have very good medication for paranoid schizophrenia. So she had loads of side effects and tremors, and she suffered just terribly. So basically, in my I suppose mid-20s or late 20s, my then boyfriend said, "Come along, let's go along to this Buddhist talk I'm going to." And I went to this teaching by someone called His Holiness Dudjom Rinpoche, who was a Nyingma master of the Dzogchen tradition. And he gave this talk on meditation and peace. And it was just the most transformative experience of my life. I mean, just complete game changer, and my whole world, a different reality. My heart opened. I literally cried for 4 hours. I just couldn't stop crying. But what he was teaching about was, yes, human beings suffer, but we don't have to. There's a way out of suffering. And the way out of suffering is to access our true self, if you like, our Buddha nature. Or if you're a Christian, you could say your Christed nature, or connecting up with our divinity. And I had an experience of light, embodied light, and everything became very spacious. I was totally in my heart. And I suddenly thought, gosh, I wonder whether my sister, could this heal her, But it was this experience of goodness, fundamental goodness, which in Buddhism, the Buddha's called Kutazampa, which means always well. And it was the first time I'd ever had an experience of feeling that I was a good person. Because before then, I'd always thought I was a bad person. I mean, we all did in our family, you know. Anyway, I found myself on the path to becoming a psychotherapist through my own sort of trauma and suffering, really, because I was just in pain a lot and worrying about the family. And so eventually I trained at somewhere called the Arbors Association, which there was American psychotherapists there who had, it was the sort of anti-psychiatry movement in those days. And Joseph Burke was there from California and Morton Schatzman. And it was this sort of therapeutic community. But I had a psychoanalytic and humanitarian experience of how can we help, because what I loved about that community was that they didn't treat people as mental patients. They treated them as human beings who were suffering. And it was just amazing that they had these therapeutic communities, and I learned so much from my experience there. I think the first thing I learned, because they dealt a lot with psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar, all the extreme ends of mental suffering. And so I was sort of using it to kind of try to understand my family. But the first thing was, are you familiar with Gregory Bateson's double bind theory? I'm sure you must be. Yeah. It's such a profound, it was like, oh, it's about traumatic relationship. It's not about psychopathology. It's not about there's something wrong with somebody from a psychopathological point of view. It's about a traumatic connection that doesn't work. And that was just so liberating, because it was, that was my first kind of connection with trauma, if you like, or anybody that mentioned trauma. Because in those days, nobody talked about trauma. It was all about psychopathology.
If I interrupt you for a second, can you hold your thought? Because I just want to say two very important things. One, I want to just pause with reverence to say how much gratitude I have for your story about your family and the way that you spoke about it. We don't often hear people share their stories of pain with such connection, clarity, and gratitude. And there was such alignment between your words, your affect, your being. I just want everyone to really sink into the depth of, and I have such gratitude for you sharing that experience of yours and how it has brought you to this place where you are, because so many of us dismiss our stories as the path to joy. So I wanted to pause for that moment and just highlight that. And second of all, I was in delight when you last spoke about trauma. And I share that with you, that shift from pathology. I think we're in the same age group. From pathology to seeing how experience. I remember the very first time listening to, here in America, Daniel Siegel and Alan Shore, and just the light bulbs that went off in the idea that the brain is shaped by our experiences and how influential trauma is in our attachments and in the way that we organize ourselves and adapt to the world around us. So your last comment was a profound piece of what I call the shift as well, away from something is wrong to how we protect ourselves to do the best we can with what we have. So thank you for those two pieces. And just hope that I didn't disrupt your train of thought.
Not at all. No. Thank you.
Mm.
Yes.
Mm.
So, gratitude, when I'm really grateful to my sister, really, because it's because ever since all of that trauma, it sort of set me on a path to search for healing, really. And quite apart from that awakening experience of suddenly realizing there's a sort of different reality, which we might today call 5D, but in those days it was called awakening anyway. But I think that I was working as a therapist at the Women's Therapy Centre. And it's interesting because I had this client that came to see me, and she said, isn't all this talking about, this same old thing again and again? Isn't this just like beating a bruise? And I thought, oh my goodness, I think she's right. It was like going on and on and on about the suffering. And as though if we talk more about suffering and bang it a bit more and bash it up a bit more, that somehow it's going to get better. And that was a real light bulb moment for me. And I must tell you this funny story. I went to see this psychic with a friend of mine. She was going because she had a relationship issue, and she said, "Oh, go on, come along." So I just sort of thought I was going to go with her. And so I went into the room, and she had all her crystal ball and everything. And I'd never been to a psychic before, and it wasn't the sort of thing I did. And anyway, I thought she was going to talk about my relationships, but she didn't. And she said, "Oh dear, dear, I can see you're talking to all these very distressed people. Oh dear, they're really very upset and very, very negative states of mind." And she said, "And they're telling you that you've got to say all this stuff that you don't believe in." True. I was being, psychoanalytic. You're supposed to give such and such an interpretation. She said, "Don't worry, dear." She said, "They just need love. Just give them love." It was the best supervision I ever had. And the other thing she said, which was really helpful, and this is sort of about intuition, she said, "Just trust yourself, dear." She said, "The words will come. Just say what comes into your mind. Just say it." And that was such helpful supervision, because what she was doing was allowing me to come from my heart, rather than all this thinking and cognition about what's happening and analyzing. It was just let it flow, basically. I'm so grateful to that woman. It was really helpful. So I have to confess to going to quite a lot of supervision and just nodding, and actually then just going off and doing my own thing. Perhaps I'm not supposed to say that.
Well, I think you've just given the rest of us a lot of relief.
Yeah, Anyway, so then I learned about trauma, the nervous system, triggering, dysregulation, creating safety, all this sort of stuff, which wasn't taught in the analytic tradition at all. But the Bowlby Centre was more attuned. And so I shifted from, a Kleinian analytic perspective, which was all about persecutory anxiety and, you know, innate badness, to no, it's nothing to do with innate badness. It's to do with trauma and dysregulation and how can we help. So, like yourself, the Alan Shaw and all that stuff, which was revolutionized, didn't it? It just made such a difference. Um, anyway, alongside that, there was this Buddhist take on suffering, which was that there is a way out of suffering when we connect up with our universal mind, unity consciousness. And I suppose that I kind of had this feeling one day when I was going through a dark night of the soul. I just thought, I was just persecuting myself and it was just really, really hard. And this kind of voice in my head just suddenly said to me, choose the path of joy.
Wow.
And it was sort of, oh, am I hearing voices? What's this? But it was a very clear message. It said, choose the path of joy, because I was sort of getting really bogged down in really bleak. So anyway, I said, okay. I suddenly got that it was a message that I had to listen to, that it was something important. So I chose the path of joy instead of all this getting bogged down in the mire of suffering. And from there, I think it sort of set a trajectory for all sorts of things to happen. So, one thing being that I connected with Tibetan Buddhism, and I took my refuge, which is taking the bodhicitta vow, which is to help beings, which when you take refuge, in a place called Jui, which means joy. It was lovely. Anyway, so I decided to choose the path of joy, and then I kind of carried on passing as I had a very split world, because one part of me was on tour because I used to work as a jazz musician playing saxophone. And another part of me was going to the Women's Therapy Centre, and we were doing all our consciousness raising and groups and whatever and workshops, and then I was going to listen to a Tibetan Buddhist guru. And when you're a feminist in a collection, consciousness raising group, you do not talk about gurus. It's not on. So I had very, very split worlds, but I was passionate about them. And then I was really interested in the sphere of energy. So I had a divination done, because in those days when you were following these paths, you went to masters and they gave you divinations, because I didn't at that point have enough autonomy to choose for myself and say, I want to do this. I sort of had to go and ask the guru's permission. Anyway, I no longer do that now, of course, but in those days, that's what I did. And what was fascinating was that I kind of secretly wanted to train as a Jungian analyst, because the choice was, should I train as a Jungian analyst, or should I do this sort of weird course I'd come across, which was a 3-year training in colour, light, and sound. Anyway, the divination clearly said 3-year course in colour, light, sound, and energy. So that's when I started learning about subtle energy. That was in 1989. And we did wonderful things. We worked with colour, colour healing, working with the subtle energy of the body, just doing etheric massage and sensing and feeling. And it was totally non-conceptual, playing with tuning forks. And that was when I realized that I was more sensitive than I realized. Because when we did the group exercises where we were all learning how to use tuning forks on one another, and everyone was going around banging their forks and putting it on bits of our body and on our backs, you're laughing, so you've been there too, have you?
Yes.
I couldn't take it. I got completely wiped out by that. It was like utterly draining. So everyone else was getting all excited about how helpful it was, and I was just totally drained. That's when I started really learning about the energy field and how you have to protect your energy field. And because I just was kind of open, I didn't have proper energy boundaries. So that's when I realized I needed to learn to contain my energy in a way that I didn't get depleted. Um,
I
anyway,
again, I have a jump in and
yes.
a question,
Good.
comment, a
Mm,
poignant pause. You
mm.
you spoke a moment ago about the voice, choose the path of joy. And here, what you, I think, are speaking about is the depth of intuition and the
Yes.
clarity of connecting to oneself that actually tunes you into what is already there within us, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And like you, I used to seek outside validation to confirm my intuition. or help me make decisions, because in 1989, those ideas were really not acceptable. And, that whole idea of, I feel this, I see this, I know this, was just not on.
That's right.
And when you described that whole concept of connecting to your intuition, this is such a huge component of therapeutic alliance. And now we talk about that every day, that actually part of evidence-based practice is the intuitive faculty that comes through attunement to self and other. So we put different fancy words on it, but now this concept of intuitive knowing is a more acceptable dialogue, isn't it?
It is, but it certainly wasn't acceptable then, was it?
Mm-mm.
It was dangerous. You're going off and doing your own thing, not to come back into line, so to follow the authorities.
And to speak it, that's why we spend so much time learning scripts, what you should say, I remember in my psychotherapy class memorizing Yalom's book of all the different dialogues of things to say in group psychotherapy. And it was just not coming from within. It was, in my learning, coming from cognition.
Yes, yes, that's right. Yeah. And so that cognition, which is the 3D mental level, instead of the sensory heart, soul, totally different experience, right brain versus left brain, I suppose you could say crudely, but yeah.
And such a different way of being in the world. And for me, Ruthie, I don't know if this is true for you, but in the 80s and 90s, this information for me I was just on fire secretly. It was like all learning, reading, I couldn't get enough of it, but I didn't have anyone to talk to about it. And then things seemed to disappear. So in my experience, in the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years, all that fire just kind of disappeared. And it made me sad until I realized it hadn't disappeared. It had just been reorganized. And in this dialogue with you, you're helping me see how present these experiences that we had in the 80s and 90s are still living, but that they have been integrated rather than being something, or have started to be integrated. I don't want to be that dramatic in my statement, but they're not so out there as unique and separate ideas. They've kind of absorbed to some degree. And I think that's what I just felt when I heard you describe how it has evolved. And that just leaves me so hopeful.
Yes, I think there really has been an evolution, and people are on a different wavelength now than they were then. But I think that has been what the shift is about, really, isn't it? But it's sort of somehow, like you said, it kind of went a bit quiet, but now it's becoming much more obvious again.
Well, and I want to thank all of my teachers who wouldn't necessarily use words of energy, but actually, if I think about it, they were. Stephen Porges, people who were, Paul Ekman, people who were in the scientific field were also delving into compassion, radical acceptance. Those dialogues, they straddled, didn't they?
Yes, they did. Me, from the attachment-based perspective, it was Daniel Stern, and he used to talk about the meeting of now moments, where there's a direct connection between therapist and client, where you get beyond ego and nobody's in any role anymore, and there's this direct communication.
Beautiful. Mm.
Yeah.
So how did the whole, again, I don't know if this is a fair question, but you can do with it what you wish. Me too, in my experience of studying Buddhism and energy psychotherapy and energy work. In my world, being an occupational therapist, craniosacral therapy, myofascial release work, tuning forks, colored therapy, glasses, all of those things were part of what arose. And this idea of spiritual conceptions and energy, there's two, a little bit of not tension, but another integrating conceptualization. So I wondered how that, you were kind of going in that direction. How did those two come together for you? Your love of the need to alleviate suffering and your invitation towards studying energy medicine.
Yes. Well, it's interesting because when I was working as a psychotherapist, I remember at the Women's Therapy Centre, we had these case discussions, and that somebody was talking about a woman who had lost her faith in God or something about that. And there was this very sort of disconnected, shall I say, woman who said, "Oh no, surely people don't still believe in God these days." So that was when I realized it wasn't safe to that was the moment when I thought I want to integrate spirituality with psychotherapy. But it was also a recognition that it wasn't safe to do so in that environment. So I kind of went underground. It was sort of like going into the closet about my spirituality. So I think Jung was the bridge, because in Tibetan Buddhism, we worked in the Vajrayana, we worked a lot with integrating practices using mantra recitation and visualization, and you project out and bring back the deity into you. You're kind of working with the sort of metaphorical and archetypal energies. And so the archetypes as a form of energy, which is actually very real. And this idea about the collective unconscious, because of course Jung was into the, as you know, the collective unconscious. And that's very much the field of energy. So that was the main bridge for me, I think, was Jung. Um, and the other was that I was living in very separated worlds. So there was one time when I was speaking at a conference in Amsterdam about Buddhism, talking about the dangers of the awakened state when the ego is fragmented. So I was trying to bring my worlds together. So I was talking about Melanie Klein and splitting on one hand, and it was like I was just trying to bring them together. And then I was invited to the States to a friend of mine was teaching a neonatal clinic in Pennsylvania. Is it Pennsylvania State University? Yeah. Anyway, and I was invited to go and talk about attachment theory and Buddhism, and
Wow.
it was extraordinary. Anyway, so that was when I started really bringing the ideas together. I was sort of about Freud and the unconscious, and kind of marrying the unconscious with energy, because actually the flow of the unconscious is the same as energy. I was sort of trying to meld them all together somehow.
Oh, Ruthie, thank you so much for being such a pioneer.
Well, thank you. I didn't think of myself as a pioneer, but I was just doing it because it presented itself. Do you know what I mean? It was like,
I do. The question
oh,
arises and the path arises and there you step. But
that's right.
but in giving it voice, it lands outside in others. And that
Yes,
is part of pioneering the shift. So in thinking. And so
yes.
that's courageous work.
Well, thank you. I have to say I did go through a periods of quite a lot of vulnerability, more in terms of being within the psychoanalytic community.
Sure.
Um, and still the psychoanalytic community would think, a lot of people would think this was all poo-poo, really. But there were some that were open. Sorry, my language.
No, I think it's great. I think it's great. I giggle because it's so great.
Um, and there was one time when I had my therapy consulting room. I had my couch and my chairs for my psychoanalytic consulting room. And then on the other side, I had a screen. And then I actually had a healing couch, where I had all the silks and the colors. And I used to work with the ascended masters and the fragrances and vibrations. Anyway, I had a client, my psychoanalytic client, who was really distraught and in such a state. And she was so in her head and she was really, really wound up and very, very ruminating and ungrounded. And she came in and I said, "Would you like some color therapy?" And she said, "Well, I don't know." So anyway, we literally crossed over to the other side of the room. She lay on the couch and we did this color healing work, sort of etheric massage. And she just calmed down. And that was when I realized, wow, energy work is really powerful. And it's completely non-verbal. It's completely beyond concepts. And it calms the body and the mind and the soul. And after then, that was shortly after then that I came across energy psychology and started training in it.
Wow. I mean, what we could today talk about developmental trauma, for example, how it lives in the nonverbal, right?
Absolutely.
And how difficult it is to change or create a shift through language and talking.
Exactly.
And, in the world of occupational therapy, the senses and the body is the embodied shifts is where regulation lives, in our belief.
My belief too, energy therapy belief as well. It has to be in the body. Has to be.
One of the terms that people don't know how to use is the spirit, that term spirit, and what it is. Because in occupational therapy, we have mind, body, spirit. It's considered part of the holism of the human.
Yeah.
And we, in a sense, our profession has a wee bit of permission giving to explore what that means to each client as a way of increasing their capacity to connect into life. But I think that, this is an element that is not discussed. And people confuse religiosity with spirit,
Yes.
which is not how we use that term. It's the essence of who we are. And, right?
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting that in our energy work, we call it mind body energy rather than mind body
Cool.
spirit.
Cool.
And we see energy as being spirit, consciousness, matter, the whole shebang, and because it embraces the unconscious, the conscious, the energy, the subtle energy, the physical, the non-physical, because it's all about the vibrational field, which is where spirit is really, our divine connection with source. But it's the same as spirit, really. But energy, to my mind, it kind of somehow embraces the idea of consciousness and it's a little bit broader for me. I don't know whether it is, but because we're working with subtle energy, maybe that's why we use that.
Well, and I think, Ruthie, the term energy is a great bridge word to allow people to consider consciousness. One of the authors that I'm really excited about right now is Dr. Mark Solms, who is a psychoanalyst from South Africa, whose entire work is around consciousness and looking at the predictive brain. He really looks at the neurobiology. And in his book called Hidden Spring, he talks about energy fields and the brain. He steps into that dialogue. And so, I think that what I experience is that when we can give a little bit of science into the dialogue, it settles the nervous system of the receiver and allows them to be more receptive. Is that your experience?
I think the science comes after the fact. I think it's exactly what you're saying, that people like to be reassured that it's proper. And somehow, if it's scientific, it must be okay.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because, these things, Buddha discovered quantum science thousands of years ago. It's not like it's just been invented. And, subtle energies existed for thousands of years with, the work with the subtle energies, the chakras, the old ancient practices of working with the channels, inner air and energy, the tickle, and it's been proven to be effective and work for thousands of years. But I think there's something about the West and society that just want a rational understanding. Because if you can rationalize it and say, well, it must be true, but that's an absurd situation with quantum science, because spooky effects at a distance completely defy.
Well, and even the concept of time in the quantum, right, is the past, present, and future all exist in the same millisecond.
That's right. Yeah.
And how hard that is to grasp in the consciousness of everyday thinking.
Yes, it is. And I think as the veil, as the energy of the biophotons or whatever, the photonic light that's coming into our atmosphere as part of this shift, we are, the veil is thinning. The egoic veil is thinning. So we have more easy access to other dimensions. And that's one of the things that I'm finding in my practice. Just as with trauma, there's no difference between past, present, and future, because somebody who's in a traumatic state will be reliving in the present what happened in the past. But equally, we're having access to other timelines, memories from past lifetimes bleeding through into this life.
Yes.
So it's sort of, that's what I've noticed quite a lot.
Okay.
And so in doing the archetypal work, and that's where I think Jung is so helpful with this idea of the collective unconscious and the archetypal experiences that we all go through, then we can clear transgenerational trauma, which goes back through many lineages, maybe, because it's in the cells and in the DNA. And we can also clear past life trauma if you believe in past life trauma, or if you don't, you could just say it's a metaphor. But it does really help to get to the roots. And it's ironic because we talk about past lives, but they're going on in a parallel present moment, aren't they?
Well, and one of the interesting things about what you're talking about here is what the brain love, and the human loves to make sense out of things. And making sense is only half the job, really. That there is so much more that lives in the field than the mind can handle, that we spin. I often feel like clients say to me, why am I still working on the same thing? I feel like I'm in the washing machine, in the spin cycle. And it's because there are places where disturbance, is how I describe it, live in the energy field as it connects into the body, into the genes, into the tissues, that are not necessarily about meaning making.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, absolutely.
And so psychotherapy, in my mind, is only part of the job in this change. And some of the most amazing revelations or shifts in consciousness have come from non-thought for me.
Yes.
Places where someone has tapped into a muscle in my body, or when I've moved in a particular way, or in a moment in the middle of a dialogue. Things that come rather than me go
They
together.
arise naturally.
Yeah.
Without thought.
Yeah.
And I guess that the way I kind of couch that would be because of the psychoanalytic aspect of me. I align that with the unconscious, and I talk about the wisdom of the unconscious body mind, because the body has so much wisdom, as you know, and it's like it arises when you do when we do energy work, clearing trauma, associations arise naturally, and you don't have to do any work to make it happen. It just manifests, and it's beautiful, isn't it?
Truly. And I'm not ever going to forget your story of your client who said, it's like a bruise that you keep banging over and over again when we just keep talking about our story. And that the story isn't necessarily where the shift occurs.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, this could be part 1 in 10 of dialogues between us. But I am just wanting to talk about this quote that I love. And this quote is from your book that I mentioned earlier. And you said here that since relationships, the quote that is relevant to me is that you said everything is energy. And giving listeners some insight into that topic that you just touched on a moment ago about everything is energy. Can you deepen that concept a little bit more?
Well, I suppose if you were to think in terms of the original Buddhist teaching of the Heart Sutra about emptiness, and it was said to be so astounding that people fainted when it was first taught, because it was talking about the fundamentally empty nature or illusory nature of reality. That things appear to be solid as objects in front of us, but actually there is no substance whatsoever in them. They're just interconnected things appearing as though they exist through conditions and causes and situations and circumstances. Now, that was the sort of physics of Buddhism, which has now been obviously realized totally by quantum physics in all sorts of manner of ways, with different people disagreeing and having arguments about this or that, and superposition and entanglement, and but nonetheless, there's a wonderful guy, I can't remember. Anyway, he discovered the thing about the fundamental emptiness of the vortex, and that basically it's all space.
Yeah.
And there isn't any matter as such, it's all space. And that is really just proving Buddha's nature of emptiness, which is the Heart Sutra. And that's where, as humanity, we meet that kind of universal energy, the quantum field, where we are one with we're one with the all. And it's that spaciousness and that emptiness and the light. So I can't remember what your question was. It was something about
No, you got it. You did it. You answered my question. Because what I was asking is, you gave me more than what I asked in your description of emptiness and how that relates to quantum physics, the sense of all things being connected through space and that collective unconsciousness. So your answer was perfect, and I can feel it in my chest. One of the delights that I had, and I think this will be my last question for now, in reading your book, was the use of energies that are received through the sensory systems. Because occupational therapists love to talk about sensation. So you've touched on this briefly throughout the conversation: light, sound, the feeling of touch, that we are receptors to energetic through our physiology. And these are modalities that you talk a lot about in the book.
Yes. I think that it comes up all the time in the work through, I mean, I suppose through three associations of the body-mind, I would say. And I would say that triggers are the greatest gift for this work. I mean, I remember when I had a client at the Women's Therapy Centre, and she just happened to look at the wallpaper, and there was a blue image on the wallpaper. So this is colour and sight. And it just took her immediately, in absolutely the instant, that was the trigger which took her back to being abused. Because when she was abused, there was a bluebird on the wall, and the colour blue was the same blue. So that was sort of an example of one of the senses being a trigger to bring us back to the wisdom of what happened. Or another one is smell, obviously. So this is another example, actually. When I was working at the Women's Therapy Centre, we had the decorators in, and so there was a smell of paint. And one of my clients suddenly said, "Oh, I want to vomit." And it was like, "Oh, what's happening?" "Oh, the smell of paint." And that just brought up the abuse, because she was abused by a decorator, painter and decorator. So the smells, the sight, the touch, sound, everything, sensation, tactile, the whole lot. They're all, I'm sure you do this in your work too. It's very much, they're very useful connecting points for leading to the core trauma that lies underneath. And I think what I find so fascinating is the truth of the body. It doesn't lie. And you can absolutely trust that if something's happening in the moment that's powerful, that is the truth. So, for example, I just had a client who had a huge reflux, and big lump in her esophagus. And actually, funny enough, it's 2 this week, so I have to talk about them, because one of them had been a child in a battle on the ocean, and she kept gagging and getting this reflux. And so we just followed that symptom through. What was this sickness, and it took us back to the terrifying trauma of being actually a tiny child in the middle of a huge battle where she could have died. And her books were on another boat. Some of her luggage was packed in a different boat, and that boat got blown up. That she survived because she was on the other boat, and all of that, just that reflex of gagging, those senses took her back to the trauma, and then that pre-verbal trauma. And what's really fantastic about energy work is that you can work without words, and you can clear trauma through the subtle energies without needing words at all. So you can clear in utero trauma, birth trauma, all of that stuff can be worked with without words.
Wow. Ruthie, how do people get some training with you? You have a program. Can you tell us about your training program?
Yes. Well, we do have a training program that's starting in September this year, 2025. We've been running it for many years. It's a 1-year program. It's for people who are qualified as therapists. So everyone needs to be registered with their appropriate body. It is international. It's online. It starts at 1 p.m. UK time. And there are 12 days of training over a period of a year, and 10 supervision groups. Each person attends 12 days of training, 10 supervision groups. And then if people want to, they can go on and do a certificate level, which is the more advanced, where you do more supervision and write case studies and so on. But there's online, people are working on themselves. And did I give you the information about it?
And I want to say more about it. So it's Energy Psychotherapy Training, experiential online clinical training in energy psychotherapy. One of the things that you really require is that people have already done some of their own work. And this is very important. And thank you for that, including that. I want to make sure that people know how to find you in your training. And you have a website. It's www.energypsychotherapytraining.co.uk, and email info@energypsychotherapytraining.co.uk. And I encourage people to find out more about you. And if you are willing, we can continue this dialogue again in the future.
I'd be delighted. Thank you so much.
Ruthie, thank you for bringing your worlds. I see the image I have of what you have shared with us today is the merge, the integration of multiple levels of knowledge and wisdom, from sensation, music, energy, psychotherapy, science. And even though you described many times the separateness, what you represent is the wholeness. So,
a lovely thing to say. Well, in turn, I really thank you for inviting me to talk. I'm really grateful to share about my book, and it's lovely. It's really interesting to talk with you. Thank you.
And maybe someday we'll find a way to sit together in person. So, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Awesome.